Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Nicola Cloete, and I will be facilitating this workshop on finding and evaluating sources. The focus of this talk is going to offer a series of strategies for finding and evaluating sources and how these might be utilized by practice-based early career researchers in the fields of design, visual, and performing arts. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about myself and my own academic background and research interests. And after that, we're going to move on to what is traditionally kind of identified as framing the problem in academic research. And we're going to talk about what kinds of problems you might be encountering in finding ideas and sources, and how to cite the kinds of work that you're wanting to include. And then we're going to talk a little bit about possible ways to solve those problems. And I'm going to propose that you start thinking about ideas around diversifying your citation lists and introducing different positionalities such as feminist citational practices, and thinking about how you can reference your own practice and your own work in developing that citation list. Then we'll move on to thinking about ways in which to evaluate sources and extending what we mean by what constitutes sources to include various practice-based approaches. And finally, we are going to look at ways in which you might want to capture your citations and sources in one space, particularly for the kinds of projects that doctoral students or postdoctoral students encounter, which can be quite large and have multiple moving parts. First, a brief introduction about myself. As I said, I'm Nicola Cloete, and I currently work in the Department of History of Art and Heritage Studies in the Wits School of Arts at Wits University in Johannesburg, South Africa. And I've been here for 7 years. And before that, I worked in the drama department in the same school. So what I suppose I have come to know about myself in the last 14 years is that I truly am an interdisciplinary scholar, and my background in theatre, gender and political studies, and then moving on to heritage studies, has meant that I'm interested in various disciplines. But across all of those, I'm particularly committed and interested to the politics of representation. My own research is broadly concerned with developing critical representational practices from this interdisciplinary position and extending that in the ways in which I come into the classroom and work within the academy specifically. Currently, my own teaching is focused on visual culture, and I'm interested in extending my concerns about how and why we look and what the implications are and the political ramifications are for these kinds of practices. In thinking about this workshop and preparing for it, I've been thinking about what that experience of a range of disciplinary focuses that are based in practice and in making and in reading the arts very broadly has taught me about strategies around how to develop and evaluate sources. And from that perspective, I'll be drawing on a lot in my own practice as an interdisciplinary scholar in the ways in which I have navigated certain of these issues, but I've also drawn from some existing scholarship, and I offer a blend of both these ways, both of these approaches in thinking about how to develop a citational practice and finding and evaluating these sources. So to recap, we're going to be looking at what's at stake with finding sources, and I should have put in inverted commas the idea of the right sources. And then looking at why it's a critical part of the research process itself, and extending on that criticality for those of you who are ending one research process in the doctoral degree and starting another in the postdoctoral process. How to develop a citational practice. And we're also going to cover how to evaluate sources, and as I said, extend the idea of what constitutes sources for practice-based researchers and practitioners. And then finally, something quite practical about where to keep them, particularly when they take on multiple forms like video and images and things that are non-text based. So I want to move then onto the idea of what, as I said earlier, might be considered the problem of finding and evaluating sources. For those of you who are in the early stages of the PhD, you might be starting to search widely and read as much as you can and encounter things and view as much as possible. And I think that that's always a valuable starting point for a number of reasons. First, it allows you to develop confidence that you've surveyed the literature or the fields well enough, but also that it allows you to become conversant in a number of different things. And for those of you who are in the postdoctoral research process, you will know that even reading widely and viewing widely and encountering widely doesn't mean that there is an extensive survey that you're able to conduct. So on both ends of the spectrum, I think it's important to be able to understand and appreciate that the activity is to situate yourself within the field and the literature and to be as conversant as possible. And in order for you to develop the confidence as the researcher, to be able to defend the ways in which you have navigated the fields. Part of that is to the second point, which is that citational practice is not necessarily a neutral act. So who we cite is never neutral. And I had one of the more kind of immediate ways in which I've encountered that in my own research, but also in my own teaching, is around the reading lists that we've developed for students over a number of years. And for those of you who might be familiar with the South African context, it would be 5 years ago now, we had the Fees Must Fall student protests and movement across a number of institutions in our country, in which one of the contention points, certainly in our school, in our department, and in our university, was around the need to decolonize the curriculum. And students looked to the reading list as evidence of our lack of commitment to a diverse, transformed institution. And they were largely correct in our attempt to teach the canon as broadly defined as we had encountered, to include what we saw as a post-colonial canon. Our reading lists, our citation lists were clearly evidence of a support of a Eurocentric and Western hemispheric so rather a kind of Northern hemispheric position around knowledge production. So that's an example of what you know, a very clear delineation in the ways in which our source list was evidence of students reading our kind of political position. On the other hand, I think in our own research, we had far more dynamic citational practices that demonstrated, certainly for us and for me, a truer articulation of where I aligned my scholarship and my ideas with. And I think that that's what I want to kind of make evident today for you here. So if developing a citation list and who we cite is never a neutral category, how do we develop a criteria for that citational practice? And to that end, there are a number of different ways in which to think about it. One of the things that I have started to make more explicit for students and for myself in the ways in which I work is to think about citation lists as an opportunity to demonstrate diversity. And as an aside, I think as researchers, obviously we work within our fields, we work across our fields, we work with established scholarship, we work with established and emerging practice-based research. One of the things that I think is also a really important place for us to look for ideas, not necessarily only about the content, but the kind of ways in which we do things, is something certainly in my own work where I'm interested in the ways in which pedagogy can be developed, is to think about I looked, for example, to blogs that people write about their own practice in the classroom. And this is one example of it. So it's from Deborah Netalicki's 2018 blog around citation lists and diversity, and she works within an Australian context. But I think that the questions are also pertinent for our discussion today. She asks of herself as the researcher and the teacher, but also asks her students and those she works with to consider a number of questions about their citation lists. So she suggests that we think about how our list situates our work in the field. And you might want to ask yourself, what kind of scholarship am I aligning my work with that is demonstrable in the citation list? She also asks us to think, for example, from what nations, cultures, and classes do my references come? To what extent do they represent Euro or Anglo-centric ways of knowing and being? And I think that that was certainly evidence for us in the ways in which our students read our class lists at the time. She also asks, for example, what is the gender mix of my reference list? And this is something that I was perhaps particularly interested in when I started my own research as a scholar of gender studies, that I was very clear that I wanted to make very explicit my positionality as well as my political interest by having a range of gender within my reference list. And I think over time, that has been perhaps a secondary consideration if I think about some of the other political concerns that I want to engage with in my work. She also asks you to ask yourself whose voices are silent and whose scholarship have you ignored or excluded. I think that these are some very practical examples of what is possible if you look at your established citation list for those who are finishing doctoral processes. And for those of you who are starting to see, if you ask those questions of someone else's citation list, what you would be able to kind of conclude from asking those questions. There are also some things that I think are sometimes considered general rules of thumb, and I include them here, not necessarily because I think that they are things that you want to take as a given, but I think that they're always useful to include in this mix of ways in which you are constituting your citation list. And this is from another researcher whose work I use, and her name is Catherine Firth, and she works again in the Australian context, and she works particularly with graduate students. And she offers an anecdotal way to think about how you constitute your citation lists, and it's often to do with the kind of casting of a film. So she thinks that you always want to kind of include the big names, and those might be the kind of equivalent of the Hollywood hard hitters or the Bollywood hard headliners rather. So the big names that everyone would expect to see if they were reading something in this field. Along with that, there would be the ones that she calls the supporting cast. So who is a good kind of addition to have? What kind of chemistry do they have on the page or on the screen? And then she offers some other strategies or things to include by considering including the work, the ones where other people have done the work so that you don't have to. And I think that this is always a valuable tip for early career researchers to use the work that your peers have done recently, to read those theses in your department, in your disciplines, so that you can build on that without necessarily having to replicate it from scratch. Also, she suggests that you include the ones who don't agree with you. And I think that this is something that I would say mixed responses to, in the sense that I think it's very important to include the people who disagree with your positionality and your argument in order to be able to counter it. But I think it also is something that you have to think about what is possible in a non-exhaustive way. So which ones of the many that might not agree with you are you thinking about including, and to what end? So there are two different ways in which to think about citation lists. One is an opportunity to demonstrate diversity, as we've spoken about firstly, and then this idea that there's a kind of general rule of thumb, and if you follow this approach around casting broadly, you might have the equivalent of a kind of general approach. But I think it's always important to think about the particularities of your own practice. And in this instance, I want to just share briefly about my own approach to citational practice. As I said, my background and experience in gender studies meant that I started very strongly with this need to be inclusive in the range of genders that I included in the work that I was doing at a particular moment. And Sarah Ahmed has written quite extensively about this, starting in about 2015, again on a number of blogs, but then developed into articles and a book in 2017 called Living a Feminist Life. And she talks about this idea of feminist citational practice. She says that citation is how we acknowledge our debt to those who came before, those who helped us to find our way when the way was obscured because we deviated from the paths we were told to follow. In this book in 2017, she says that she only cites feminists of color who have contributed to the project of naming and dismantling the institutions of patriarchal whiteness. And I want to point out two things about her particular approach. The first is that she's very explicit about what it is. And I think as practice-based researchers and practitioners, it's very important to be able to articulate what your citational practice is and what kinds of things that it includes and what strategies you're employing, because that allows you to frame the project in particular ways. So the first thing I want to kind of signal there is the value of being explicit about what your citational practice is, and then to demonstrate what the implications are for that citational practice, and that it is conscious, and that it is particular, and that it forwards a particular scholarship that you're interested in producing. And those two things, I think, are particularly important in the ways in which we then develop that criteria for inclusion in our own citational practice, and that we can then articulate that we know that it's not a neutral act, but it is explicitly produced in a particular way in order to shape knowledge production in a certain direction. So I also want to share today with you all about what that might mean, like what these strategies might look like in practice. I've said in my own work, I try to include a range of genders in the earlier research that I conducted. And now I think about including the matrix around gender, race, sexuality, class, and being able to have those things inform the ways in which I think about the scholarship that I'm trying to include. I know that this, for those of you who are at the end of a doctoral process and starting a postdoctoral process, this might be very obvious to you. So apologies if this is familiar territory that that I'm covering here. But I also wanted to include it as something that I still actively do as part of the work, the research that I produce and the practice that I'm engaged in. And so one of the things, the place that I start when I'm looking for sources, and this is a range of sources, the moment confined to kind of traditional text-based resources and people within the academy, broadly speaking, is I still use Google Scholar quite actively. And again, if you are familiar with Google Scholar, this will be known to you. But for those of you for who this might be a new process, I think it's valuable to just take a quick look at what kinds of things are possible on Google Scholar. So one of the people that I am interested in terms of their scholarship is Sarah Ahmed, whose feminist citational practices I've just mentioned. And because she is a scholarship or a professional and an academic, she has a number of there's information here that kind of verifies who she is, but there's also terms that describe her work. And just to say, as people who are starting as researchers, you might also want to set up your own Google Scholar profile, which will allow you to track and your own citations later on. But you'll see that over here, you can have the option to follow Sarah Ahmed. And if you click on that page, it will open up this window, which gives you a series of things that you can follow by this author. I'm particularly interested in the new work that is being cited by Sarah Ahmed, but also what other people are doing with her ideas. So I've included new citations to this author, as well as new articles related to this author's research. That does mean I get far more notifications about it, but I'm interested in how these ideas kind of grow and develop. And in that sense, I want to know what else people are doing with the ideas. If we go back to that first page, you'll see that you can also look at, for example, one of her top cited publications, which is The Cultural Politics of Emotion. And if you click on that, you'll see all of the, well, not all of them, but many of the works that cite this particular text. And you'll see on the right-hand side, there are links to those texts, and they range from ResearchGate and academia.edu to links to journal articles. And they give you a range of what is most recent. If you look at the top left-hand corner over here, you can ask for citations since 2021. So you can see, you can keep up to date with it in that sense. And so when I'm looking for sources that are more scholarly located, and I know that that person is has a publication record that I can track, and I want to know more about what it is they've written, I find that Google Scholar is really quite useful. It's also available to everyone. You don't have to have access to a library subscription, etc., etc. And I think that those are things that I'm quite committed to making more usable and kind of more broadly used, the things that allow many people to access them. So that's the first example I wanted to just talk to you about, where you might look for sources. The next is around recording of live events, and this is really something that has happened for me over the last 18 or so months since COVID-19 and the kind of end of a number of live events as we are used to kind of encountering them. And what I have been able to do, instead of being present with the and attend many of the events and happenings that would have been part of my normal research process, is to be able to access them through the recordings of these events. So things like live talks or symposia or lectures or exhibition openings are now available and are streamed, but also then recorded. One of the tips I often give to my students and researchers I'm working with is to subscribe to YouTube channels. And I think it also demonstrates perhaps my age, but I think that a lot of material is available via YouTube that you might not necessarily have encountered before. And it is curated in particular ways, so you can have access to things that were available from 10 years ago, or last week's lecture at NYU that, you know, I would never have been able to get to from Johannesburg today. But as a result of all of the various lockdowns, one of the side effects has been that we have this increased access to online material. One of the other things I am looking to, or sites I'm looking to, sources, places I'm looking to for sources rather, in recent months, are around open access scholarly material. And here I think a number of arts-based research journals are open access. And in that instance, I'm interested in looking to the ways in which not only the content that they include, but I'm interested in terms of how they document these events like exhibitions and performance and installation art. So I'm interested in the ways in which that form manifests the non-text-based event or the practice, and how that might inform the kinds of ways in which I can think about accounting for my own practice in that way. And then when you're looking for sources or possible places for sources, I also included the more obvious or traditional ones around bibliographies and reference lists, looking, for example, at news alerts. Mainstream news publications have been incredibly valuable to kind of get a sense of what's happening in the arts-based world. For me recently, I use social media and the idea of subscription and follows specifically for research. And as I said, I've also look at discipline-specific journals. And I'm going to look at a few examples of that in a minute. I also just wanted to say, before I move on to that, in my own research, when I am activating feminist citational practice, it looks very particular. So I know I offered you a list of things that other people have kind of proposed you include. For me, I look to include specific things. So I look to include local authors, so work from both established and emerging scholars. I look at what my colleagues and institutions around me are writing and doing, and I'm keen to engage with those ideas. I also look to include local artists and practitioners. So whilst I say that there are news alerts from mainstream news, and I get a lot of information from kind of European and North American arts institutions about what their artists are doing, I'm really also interested in what local artists and practitioners are doing as they speak more specifically to the kinds of questions I'm interested in. I also look to include scholars from Africa, especially around theoretical ideas and positions. And so here I'm always very clear to say I'm not looking to the continent for content or illustrative examples of ideas that I'm importing from North American context. I'm interested in how Africans theorize and conceptualize their own experience and existence. And theoretically, I'm interested in applying those ideas to my own work and also finding ways to start to theorize in that vein. I always am looking to include women of color, particularly in order to disrupt some of the established power dynamics about how academic institutions function and the site of knowledge production. And I look to include broadly different artistic examples and practices. So as I said earlier on, I have a kind of organic, let's say that, an organically developed background in theatre and performance and gender and politics and now heritage and visual culture. And I'm interested in all of those artistic practices and how they might help us understand something about the world. And I'm actively always trying to pursue the spaces where there is an overlap between those things. And so those are my kind of 5 points that those are questions I ask myself in my own research. Have you included this? Have you looked for this? Have you responded? Have you checked that you haven't overlooked this? So those are the questions that I ask myself in my own practice in terms of trying to maintain and really kind of extend what this feminist citational practice looks like in my own scholarship. In the next section, I want to talk very briefly about evaluating sources and what that might look like. And as I said, we've looked at what I've kind of proposed, looking at Google and Google Scholar and looking at recorded sessions, etc., etc. But I think it's important to open up this idea of what constitutes a source, particularly for practice-based researchers and practitioners. And as we know, what is a source for us, or source material might not necessarily be readily found in a book or a reference list that we've encountered. And here I want to refer to this idea that Catherine Firth has developed around an Inga Mubin about references being magic. And it's taken from a book called How to Fix Your Academic Writing Trouble. And I want to thank organizers for their feedback here, particularly Professor Kenny, about this idea of really underscoring the value of thinking about academic writing for practitioners and practice-based researchers. So Firth and Mubin suggest that references are magic. They are these tiny little nuggets hidden in brackets and footnotes that confer power and protection to researchers. And they suggest that since references have power, you can't just use any old citation. The researcher's name must be credible for there to be authority and knowledge embedded in it. And they suggest asking yourself a few questions, and I'm going to have a look at those questions, but I just want us to think about this idea of credibility, authority, and knowledgeable in the space of practice-based research and for practice-based practitioners. What might credibility, authority, and knowledge look like, and where does it reside in the kinds of sources that we encounter? And how does that relate to the writing that we end up doing in relation to our projects? And the first point is that I think it's important to note that the writing doesn't replace the practice itself. As you all know, the writing is meant to frame that practice for academic audiences. And in that sense, I think it is true that the ways in which we use sources are magic in that sense, in that they confer this credibility and authority to us as the researchers and the work that we've done, and they make it legible for an academic source or audience in that sense. So if I think about Meuben, Firth, and Lehman's idea, or this question that they suggest, that you ask yourself, is your academic reader or examiner likely to know of the researchers you've cited? Are the scholars referencing publishing in significant journals, etc., etc.? I think those are valuable questions to ask, but I would slightly amend them in relation to the case of practice-based researchers and practitioners, because the sources you are citing might not necessarily be researchers that your reader might know. I think you can assume that the readers or the academic audience is always aware of the place and the value of practice-based research, so they might, but it is the job then of the writing that you are developing to introduce and to locate those examples of practice-based or practice practitioners, exhibitions, performances, installations, films, compositions, etc., in such a way that they are able to locate them within the literature, within the field, and be able to locate them in a way that allows them to know and understand their credibility and how they are being used to contribute and to construct this knowledge production. So I think the question for us as researchers is, how do we use that writing to frame our introduction of these sources and this material in such a way that it is establishing that credibility and that authority, and that we can then move on to producing or kind of demonstrating the knowledge in that section. I think question two, is the research you cite up to date? I think one of the things that we kind of looked at in terms of checking most recent citations perhaps covers that, but some of the other strategies around subscribing to those outlets, or following, or kind of keeping up to date with the institutions or the artist's page, is one of the more direct ways to kind of check that you are up to date with ways in which you are citing the practice or the artist in a particular way. The third question around, have you cited the foundational works in your field? I think we can, there is the equivalent around what we would consider foundational practices. Are the works that you're including illustrative of the ways in which the practice might have been established, how it's changed in recent years? So I think that there are ways in which we can adapt these questions to help make them more relevant for practice-based researchers and practitioners, but that allows you to, in answering them, use the academic writing to frame and introduce the practice that you are engaging in and offering kind of critical insight into as credible and as authoritative. I think that the last three, question 4, 5, and 6, around whether you've used enough tokens, if we think about references as these magic tokens, is similarly useful, about having read and viewed and looked broadly, as I spoke about earlier on, that is equally relevant to the ways in which we evaluate the kinds of sources that we're including. And those last two, have you read only academic articles, and do your citation choices show you've read and engaged with work that challenges your assumptions? Those are reflective of some of the questions around developing a critical citation list that is diverse and robust. I think they have their equivalencies there, and I think that they offer similar kinds of questions for you to consider about how you evaluate the sources that you're including. The next few slides that I've included here are examples of sources that I am using in a current research project that I'm looking at, which looks at walking methodologies as a form of pedagogy in the arts, visual arts classroom. And to this end, I'm interested in this first example for a number of reasons. So this is the article page for an article entitled Narratives of Mobility, Navigating from Gautrain Park Station to Wits Art Museum via Jorrison Street. And it's from the Ellipsis Journal, which is published out of the Wits School of Arts. And what along with the argument that is made, which is of relevance to the project that I'm working on at the moment, I'm also really interested in the form that the article takes within the journal website itself, in that it is animated. So as you land on the web page, there is an audio that you can start with. There is an accompanying visual that is animated and allows you to follow these certain tracks in particular ways. And then on the side there is a key, I think, for want of a better word, that allows you to navigate and understand something else about the tactics that the authors proposed in terms of the argument that they're making. And so just to say that I'm interested in the form, particularly here, and I think that it offers something really dynamic about what's possible in terms of how we account for and document our research. The second is from a page for the Journal of Artistic Research, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with before. And I think that, again, it might be demonstrating my age, but one of the things I'm really interested in at the moment are word clouds. And I think that those, for me, seem kind of effective ways to think about the range of kind of discourses that I'm engaged in, but to see them visually presented in a different way. And so I'm interested in the ways in which something like this can allow me to think strategically about my approach to this research project and how we might want to kind of frame and foreground certain things. So I think that visually what I like about this, and we're using in our collaborative research project, is it allows us to foreground and also put into the background a range of ideas, and that there's a dynamic interplay between those. And then finally, this is an Instagram page of a walking tour. So as I said, the project I'm currently working on is a collaborative project with a number of colleagues in the school, and it's based around our pedagogic approach to teaching a post-colonial art history course, and it's developed into this research project. So we were interested in how walking methodologies might allow us to understand something about the embodied experiences of land, landscape, and law particularly, and how those might be traditionally understood within an art historical context and curriculum, and how an embodied walking pedagogy might shift some of those things. And I came across this page and this person called Aware Kaapstad, and they're based down in Cape Town, and they are offer a walking tour of Cork Bay. Apologies for that. And they are interested in kind of disrupting the established narrative of the community and the ways in which its history is articulated. And I've included this Instagram page here for a number of reasons, and largely as a source. So as I said, I'm not interested necessarily only in finding sources that I can kind of use as illustrative of ideas. So it's not necessarily that I'm wanting to engage with Aware Kaapstad or the woman who runs it, Tracy Kwai, as material for the project, but rather I'm interested in the ways in which what they do, or how this page, for example, leads us to understanding a range of sources in a different way. So I'm interested in the page and the project for what it offers as a way forward in other areas, whether they are mainstream media. If I look at the Daily Maverick article over here, or what others have said, or the kinds of ways in which they are using kind of social media, merchandising, and algorithms in terms of giveaways. So I'm interested in what kinds of information I can discern from the page, and then be able to also understand what is possible around speaking with Tracy, working, working with Aware Kaapstad. So I'm going to stop there, but I hope, I suppose, that what I'm using this as an example of is how this is a source, how I encountered this as a source to start with. So I kind of come across it as part of the Instagram algorithm that pops up because I use my Instagram as a research site, and then what kinds of leads I have, I suppose, coming out of that allow me to think about collaboratively extending the possibility of the source material in particular ways. The last part of today's talk is around capturing sources, and I think particularly of importance given that we are working with non-text-based approaches and practices, and sometimes it is difficult to maintain all of those in one place. So the ones that I'm proposing you might want to think about is really around software that allows you to keep things in one place. And I think for those of you who are finishing a doctoral process and starting a postdoctoral project, the nature of those projects are large and often unwieldy, and they include multiple sources in different places. So being able to access them in one place is really important. You are probably all familiar with Zotero, which allows you to import bibliographic software, as well as to keep reading material in one place, and to be able to efficiently produce reference lists. And I think that that's valuable. That's the extent of what I use Zotero for. I know that there are multiple other ways in which you can use it, and I think if you haven't encountered it yet, it's really a valuable thing to make use of all of this free elements to it. But the thing I suppose I'm using quite a lot of recently is Evernote, and particularly its web clipper function. So because I'm working quite a lot with social media and material online in recent months, particularly since COVID, I need to be able to document it in one place as it exists online. That includes saving all of its metadata. That isn't just me taking screen grabs of things, which is kind of where I started. One of the other great things about Evernote, particularly for my purposes and really in social media, is that it allows you to capture that material as it exists. So if someone deletes that post and it's no longer available in your saved section on Instagram, you still have access to it as part of your Evernote. And I think that both of these two software have free functions, and I think that that's really useful. For the bigger projects, so when you are at the stage that you have a number of sources that you're wanting to start working with, I really do recommend Scrivener for a number of reasons. The first is that it is really, I would say, kind of creatively intuitive, and in the sense that it is developed for people who are creative practitioners who want to be able to do multiple things with the interface. And I've just done a screen grab here of someone's book that they are writing, and all of the various chapters that they're doing. But as you see, it's also got a corkboard function. And so you can see the extent of the project at a draft if you needed to. And I think as creative-based researchers and practitioners, we're often working in visually dynamic ways. And I think it's important to have software that allows us to do that. One of the other great functions about Scrivener, particularly around resources and keeping them in one place, is that it has a research function that allows you to import really huge folders. So I have a colleague who is finishing up her doctorate, which looked at her family photographic archive that went back to the early 1900s in a small rural town in South Africa, and she was able to digitize all of those images and store them in in this research folder on Scrivener, and it be able to process them as she worked on it. So it didn't really slow down her processing capacity of her machine, which I think is incredible. And particularly as we're working with such big folders, it allows you to import video, audio, images, all of those things. And I think that's a really valuable thing to be able to have access to in one place as you're working on your various projects. So I want to end today then with just on a final note about the value of sources and the value of a clear citational practice. The value of a good source is what's at stake, resides in what's at stake without it. And I've spoken a little bit about the credibility of the work itself and being able to communicate explicitly what that value is and the credibility of it for practice-based researchers. And I think that the value of a good source allows you to do that. I think that the value of a good citational practice is that it allows you to situate your work within the field and within scholarship and practice quite explicitly. And as you develop your research careers, I think it's really important to be able to articulate that from the very beginning. Finally, the value of ongoing evaluations and inclusions. I think that one of the benefits of practice-based research is that it is quite self-reflexive in the sense that we are alive to the importance of what's happening now. And I think being able to include what's happening now in our sources and keeping them relevant is incredibly important. So I want to just thank you for your time today, and I hope that that has been a useful discussion about the range of ways in which you can go about and the strategies that you can employ in terms of finding and evaluating your sources. Thank you.